Funding for Frontline is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Tonight, Frontline and Time magazine examine the future of the U.S. commitment to the NATO alliance.
We're the cutting edge, the front line, the first people that will be engaged in any type of conflict.
But when nuclear weapons are reduced in Europe, could the armies of NATO actually win a war?
We feel that our skills outnumber their numbers.
Tonight, the defense of Europe.
From the network of public television stations, a presentation of KCTS Seattle, WNET New York, WPBT Miami, WTVS Detroit, and WGBH Boston. This is Frontline. In association with Time magazine, a special report with Judy Woodruff.
Good evening. This is an unusual Frontline. In the first place, we have combined forces with Time magazine to co-produce periodic specials for public television. This is our first venture. Second, tonight's program will be somewhat different in form, made up of 5 separate stories, but all with a common theme. Tomorrow, President Reagan leaves for Moscow, the next summit with Mikhail Gorbachev. He takes with him not only an American agenda, but also the hopes and fears of our West European allies. Today, the 16 nations of NATO field a combined armed force of nearly 2.5 million troops. The United States has committed 335,000 Americans to active duty in Europe, 2/3 stationed in Germany. To see what life is like for the American servicemen and women in Europe, we spent 5 wintry days with the U.S. 5th Army Corps on the East German frontier.
Every time he takes his Aero Scout helicopter on border patrol, Captain Michael Dwyer must be ready for the worst.
We're the cutting edge, the front line, the first people that will be engaged in any type of conflict. We're looking for any signs of an increase in activity on the East German side when we're flying the border. I guess everybody's a little bit worried. You would be inhuman if you weren't worried about the possibility of becoming involved in World War III. Both sides are very wary and cautious of ever bringing about a escalation of small incidents.
This is the front line of the Cold War, perhaps the most militarized place on Earth. Winston Churchill called it the Iron Curtain, but today's GIs call it the Trace. 1,300 kilometers long, the border dividing East and West Germany forms NATO's central front. Since the end of World War II, 2 vast armies have peered out across this barbed wire no man's land. But the era of fear and mistrust may be coming to an end. Under the terms of an agreement signed in 1986, Warsaw Pact observers have been invited to watch the U.S. Army's 5th Corps on maneuvers. These officers serve in the armies of Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, East Germany, and Russia.
We escort them around and take very good care of them and make sure that they see all the important things that they need to see.
We should know for our government, for our Ministry of National Defense, if this kind of activity is threatening us or not.
Please feel free to ask the crew or myself any questions that you may have.
Ironically, these Warsaw Pact officers probably know more about the American Army than most American taxpayers.
They would never permit me the access to go talk to their soldiers that we permit them. They see a sergeant and ask a sergeant, "Where are you? What are you doing here?" And he pulled out a map the other day and said, "I'm right here We're part of A Company. Our mission is we're going up here to do that. And then one of them said to the other in a language that one of our translators could hear, "The sergeant has a map." He said, "Sergeants aren't supposed to have maps. Only colonels are supposed to have maps."
There are 8 NATO armies in West Germany. 1 Dutch, 1 British, 1 Belgian, 3 German, and 2 American. The 5th Army Corps defends a strategic choke point known as the Fulda Gap. It would almost certainly be one of the Warsaw Pact's main lines of attack.
The Fulda Gap is the shortest path from eastern Germany to major crossing sites over the Rhine River. It is a dangerous avenue of approach that we cannot let be penetrated.
Point man for the whole 5th Army Corps is the Black Horse Regiment, based in Fulda.
Group, attention. Sit down, please.
Colonel Thomas White.
Good morning. Good morning, sir. Welcome to the Black Horse Regiment. The mission of the Black Horse out here is very simple. First, patrol the East German border, all 368 kilometers of it, every day of the year, 24 hours a day. Very demanding mission. 50 kilometers to the east of here, roughly 30 miles, is a motorized rifle regiment of the Soviet Union. So when the alert siren blows and it's time to suit up, school is out. Okay. All right, let's move out.
If the siren ever does blow, first in line could be the crew of an M1 tank called Charlie 24, based here at Outpost Alpha. The M1 tank is crewed by 4 men: the commander, the gunner, the loader, and the driver.
If the war really did break out, we know it would be the first line of defense until the reinforcements come. It's hard to really say whether we'll survive or not. Most people predict that we won't.
I think we would, because we have a lot of dedicated personnel who want to live.
If we do die, we're dying for our country. I know that we're ready to go anytime, 24 hours a day.
Outpost Alpha sits right on top of the East German border, some 50 kilometers northeast of Fulda. It is the Black Horse Regiment's most forward position. Within the perimeter of the outpost is an observation tower. Inside, American servicemen monitor the movements of their East German counterparts.
With searchlight, 2 BTs.
Both sides overlook the so-called Death Strip, a 10-meter-wide communist-built no-man's land that lies between them. These fences are all inside East German territory. But on the western side, these white poles are all there is to mark the limit of what is, legally speaking, the actual border. There are no restricted frontier zones, no wire fences. So this is the trace, and every day it's the job of the Black Horse Regiment to patrol it.
If you tell someone at home that you're at the border or patrolling the border, they might just get a blank image in their mind of a border. So what, big deal. But I don't really think that they know the importance of it.
The first time I come out, it was kind of scary because you look across the border and you see they're all fenced in and we're allowed to be free and do what we want to do.
I thought maybe there would be something different from us, but they're same, like human beings like us. It's kind of scary. I wonder what they be thinking about when they see us over here and the things that we can do and they can't do. And I always get that fuzzy feeling that they kind of feel trapped.
But the foot patrols are also gathering valuable intelligence, which they report back to headquarters.
Roger, 1107.
Intelligence Officer Major Thomas Beeson.
As you can see from the antennas, we think it's some kind of an intelligence collection facility.
If we see an increase in intelligence, in reconnaissance patrols, an increase in flights along the border, that increased activity indicates something to us, and we would start ringing bells and lights would go off.
If the Russian blitzkrieg ever rolled west, Outpost Alpha would be the first to know.
If you hear the siren in the back of your mind, you hear, is this the real one? Are we going to really go out and do something?
On our level, you really have no way of knowing if it's a drill or if it's the actual alert.
There are 226,000 American military personnel in Germany. But with them are another 225,000 wives, children, and dependents.
Okay, make sure you keep an eye out to the right over there.
As the first shots are fired, a massive evacuation would begin.
Each time that horn go off, I wonder, is this the real thing? Is my family gonna get out here safely? Yes, I always wanted to be worried about that.
As soon as the siren sounds in Outpost Alpha, the Black Horse Regiment's Cobra helicopters based at Fulda would scramble into the air. Cobra pilot Heath McLaughlin.
First line of defense is to kill as many tanks as possible without being killed ourselves. By being close to the border, it sometimes makes you worry or wonder about the equation between our troops and their troops, our equipment, their equipment. Many times we'll be flying neck and neck or with another aircraft, and he's just on that side of the fence and we're just on this side of the fence within stone throw away, and you're wondering, what's he thinking of us? We seem to be outnumbered in many ways, and of course that tends to make me worry a little bit, and I hope that our sophistication can keep us ahead of what they have.
If war broke out, a huge battle would develop in the Fulda Gap. Though heavily outnumbered, the armies of the West would be allowed neither retreat nor tactical withdrawal, because this would guarantee the destruction of much of West Germany. So NATO is committed to a forward defense. Though the Soviets have many more tanks, geography could help the Fifth Army Corps stop them dead in their tracks.
If he could deploy all of his 19 divisions at one time on line, he could probably overwhelm us, but he can't do that because the terrain won't allow him to do that.
It's like two football teams. One team can have a tremendously strong bench, but they can only field 11 players at the same time, both teams. And that's really what we face here. The terrain restricts their movement, so we can only face a limited amount of them at one time.
As the Alliance tries to fight the first line of invaders to a standstill, it knows that wave after wave of attackers are on their way.
As they get closer to the border, then some of our long-range artillery can come into effect and help out on that follow-on forces attack. So while we are combating the first close battle forces, we have to hold the other forces back off the battlefield. That is predominantly a job that we depend on our air forces to do.
Pilots of the 10th Tactical Fighter Wing would have to dogfight their way past Russian MiGs in order to strafe enemy reinforcements. It's Warsaw Pact military doctrine to advance in echelons. NATO aims to attack these follow-on forces before they join the main battle, preferably in choke points like the Fulda Gap, where they're most vulnerable.
I don't think it will be easy if hostilities break out. We're far outnumbered, so we're going to have to depend on those things that make us better to carry that conflict to the enemy.
We feel that our skills outnumber their numbers. However, that does not take away the impact that we know that there's going to be a horde of Warsaw Pact type forces coming at us.
We're going to have to achieve a kill ratio of 4, 5, 6 to 1 in order to stay even. So we've got to do better than that to get ahead.
If the fighter planes, helicopters, tanks, and howitzers cannot stop the Warsaw Pact's advance, other, more terrible weapons are waiting in the wings. The crew of this Lance missile launcher plays a kind of deadly hide-and-seek in the forests of West Germany. The platoon commander is Lieutenant Joan Fontaine.
We fire conventional weapons and nuclear weapons. We have to shoot and scoot, so to speak. Our march order time is less than 5 minutes, so after we fire, we have to get out of the area immediately.
If defeat seemed inevitable, it is NATO policy to use nuclear weapons, and use them first.
On behalf of the 85th Maintenance Battalion, I would like to present to each one of you our battalion coin.
On the eve of summit talks about peace and disarmament, the Warsaw Pact observers say their goodbyes.
My country, my soldiers, my officers want peace in Europe, first of all. And this is the most important thing, that we can meet American soldiers and can talk about it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Meanwhile, almost 5 million soldiers on both sides of the Iron Curtain are ready for war.
Pleasure. From one tradition to another. Very good. Thank you, sir.
12, 11, 10, 9.
Even after the INF agreement, NATO alone has 4,000 battle-ready nuclear warheads.
4, 3, 2, 1, fire. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
The possibility of a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union is a shattering prospect for American troops and the American people. But for the people of Western Europe, any conflict with the Warsaw Pact, even a conventional war, would be fought in their own backyard. In this next segment, we examine European fears and their impact on the politics of NATO in the life of one West German village.
The pretty little village of Bell lies in the West German district of Hunsrück, about an hour's drive northwest of Frankfurt. Reinhard Sesch lives with his wife in this 500-year-old home. He works as a computer engineer for IBM and is an unlikely political activist. But every day as he drives to work through this peaceful place, he is forcibly reminded that one day Bell could find itself in the very eye of the nuclear storm. His neighbors know it too and are protesting. One farmer has painted his barn. Another has planted a field with 96 crucifixes. Each cross represents an American cruise missile with a nuclear warhead on German soil.
We are a very small country with over 4,000 military installations, and we have military every meter here. On the street, you see tanks on the streets, and I think Germany has a very big burden for NATO military.
Like most Germans of his age, Reinhard had grown up with the American military presence and had grown used to it. But when cruise missiles with nuclear warheads were deployed in his district, he decided that enough was enough. Like hundreds of thousands of other Germans, he became active in the peace movement.
We know that there are nuclear weapons here because you only have to look in the emblem of the official 50th Tactical Fighter Wing, and there you will see the nuclear weapon in this emblem. How will you defend Europe with 4,000 or 5,000 nuclear warheads? Everything is destroyed.
These fears came to a head in the early 1980s. The decision to deploy Pershing II and ground-launched cruise missiles led to enormous anti-nuclear demonstrations throughout Europe. And nowhere more so than in Germany. Even in Bell, local residents were joined by 200,000 protesters in a march on the Wuschheim Air Station, an American cruise missile base outside the village. Jutta Dahl and her husband August, a Lutheran pastor, led that large peaceful protest in 1986.
We realized that with those weapons which are being stationed here in this village, you could easily kill about 80 million people. And I think American people, they don't feel as threatened by the weapons as we do, because the density here is so enormous. And we are living so close to the Iron Curtain that we really know when there will be an era and when there will be a war, we will be destroyed at once.
Ironically, the protesters find sympathy from the man who first invited America to deploy the missiles in Germany, Helmut Schmidt.
Quite a few of the people became nervous. It's understandable. It's very easy for a nuclear power like the United States or like Britain or like France to install a few more missiles. It's quite a different thing if somebody else puts nuclear missiles onto your soil and reserves for himself the right to unleash these missiles, because people nowadays do understand that missile sites are target sites as well for the other side.
While Americans complain that they bear too much of the cost of European defense, Germans say they bear too much of the risk. Beate Klarsfeld, who lives near Bell, maintains her watch on a U.S. cruise missile base. As she sees it, the American military has made Germans second-class citizens in their own land. In recent months, the peace movement has obtained this document. It is the Non-Combatant Evacuation Order, a confidential document issued to all American military personnel based in Germany and their dependents. For Beate, it makes alarming reading.
This plan says that when there is a day where the atomic strike will start, then the Americans will be evacuated and we have to stay at our homes and we should die here. So German police and German organizations will stop us to flee, but the Americans can flee.
What upsets the Germans about the document is that with the American families, their furniture and even their pets will also be evacuated. Though the days of the great peace demonstrations have passed, politicians in Bonn are well aware that anti-nuclear sentiment runs right across the political spectrum, and it runs deep. Even conservative politicians who believe that German security depends on the nuclear deterrent admit that while they may have a majority, they do not have a consensus. The member of parliament who speaks for the government on defense issues is Volker Ruhe.
We will have something like 4,000 nuclear warheads still left after the INF agreement, and I think we could do with fewer systems.
Though the INF agreement will remove the hated cruise and Pershing IIs, short-range weapons remain. NATO has decided to modernize and upgrade tactical nuclear weapons like this Lance missile. If it was ever fired in anger, it could only land in East or West Germany. Volker Ruhe must explain to his constituents why it's a good thing to get rid of intermediate nuclear weapons that can hit other countries, but modernize systems that can only kill Germans.
But we're in a unique situation. We're the only country in the West that has nuclear weapons on its soil that are planned to be used on German soil. And there's no doubt the shorter the range of these missiles, the deader the German.
Meanwhile, the peace protesters from Bell hold their weekly prayer vigil outside a U.S. missile base. The peace activists are small in number, but they have had a tremendous impact on public opinion. A recent poll found that while 68% of Germans want to stay in NATO, 79% don't want nuclear missiles on German soil. And that is a political problem, not just in Germany, but for the whole of NATO.
Here in Washington, far from the nuclear battlefield, the Senate is embroiled in its own political battle over ratifying the INF Treaty. But in the think tanks of Washington and over at the Pentagon, there is another debate brewing over non-nuclear or conventional weapons. Today, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact hold an enormous numerical advantage over NATO's conventional forces. 6 times as many mechanized infantry combat vehicles, 3 times as many artillery pieces, and most significantly, 2.5 times as many tanks. And so, many people fear that if all nuclear weapons were ever banned, the Soviet Union would be able to dominate Western Europe. But do the numbers tell the whole story? Some people say they don't, and that NATO and the Warsaw Pact are more evenly matched than most of us realize. To find out why, we set out to investigate what the Pentagon calls the tank gap. This pontoon bridge is one of the few pieces of Soviet technology that the West is copying. It tells us a lot about Soviet military doctrine. The Soviets may not want to start a war, but if hostilities do break out, they believe that the best form of defense is attack. So a bridge like this is built for an army on the advance. To carry out their offensive strategy, the Soviets have built an enormous conventional army, an army that on almost every count is 2 or 3 times bigger than NATO's. The main weapon in this army is the tank. One of the first Westerners to have observed the armored columns of the Warsaw Pact on maneuvers is General Mallory.
And it was all over in 59 minutes, and they had upwards of 4 tank regiments across that river. Very, very impressive. Great speed at putting a lot of combat power across a pretty significant river obstacle.
General Glenn Mallory was not equally impressed by everything he saw at the Druzhba 86 exercise in Czechoslovakia. On a real battlefield, it seems, numbers aren't everything.
And I was standing there on the observation platform thinking to myself, wow, wouldn't I love to be a tank battalion commander out there as I watch this come at me, because they're so close, they can't shoot from the second row without shooting themselves, and we just have a turkey shoot out there.
On the face of it, the Soviet numerical superiority is overwhelming. Its fleet of 52,000 main battle tanks outnumbers NATO's 20,000 by 2.5 to 1. But in Washington, so-called bean counting, the idea that weight of numbers is all that matters when assessing military strength, has been challenged in a Senate Armed Services Committee report called Beyond the Bean Count. One of those who gave evidence to the committee was Josh Epstein of the Brookings Institution.
Historically, bean countings proved to be terrible predictors of military outcomes. If you bet on the side with the numerically larger force, you'd have been wrong at Antietam, Chancellorsville, Austerlitz, Fredericksburg, Battle of Frontiers in World War I, the fall of France in 1940, Barbarossa in 1941, the invasion of Korea, the Sinai and Golan in 67 and 73, and more recently in the Falklands. Bean counting is pseudo-empirical bunk. It just doesn't tell you much about the actual dynamics of combat.
Perhaps the best place to observe the actual dynamics of combat is at the National Training Center, Fort Irwin, California. Here, 1,000 square miles of the Mojave Desert have been turned over to the Army for full-scale mock tank battles. Every time a weapon is fired, a laser beam is discharged. A flashing yellow light tells the crew when their tank has been destroyed. The laser gun is linked to a gigantic computer, which records if a hit was scored or not. What makes these extraordinarily realistic exercises unique is the presence of the so-called OP-4, the opposing force or red team. Not only does the OP-4 use equipment modified and camouflaged to look like Warsaw Pact armor, but their tactics are based entirely on Soviet military practice.
So they piecemeal through here.
The Op-4 soldiers in their mock Soviet uniforms have the advantage in numbers. And at the tactical level, this gives them tremendous operational flexibility, according to their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Doug McFarland.
Tactics for the Soviet in the offense, obviously, is to try and attempt to find the weakest point in the U.S. defenses. When he finds that weak point, he wants to attack that with a favorable force ratio. That's 3-to-1, 4-to-1, 5-to-1, whatever it thinks it takes to be able to mass, make a penetration, and exploit that penetration by getting deep within the U.S. sector and get into the, through the main crust, and then into perhaps the softer part of the sector itself.
Life is more complicated for the Blue commander, but as in real life, he has some real advantages over the Reds. Defenders know their terrain better and can fight from well-prepared positions. They can pre-position a considerable number of anti-tank weapons. Minefields can be laid across the main avenues of attack. All this gives the defense such an edge that military textbooks assume an attacker would need a 3-to-1 advantage to win. The Reds can maneuver their superior numbers to concentrate their forces and achieve odds of 3-to-1 and better at key points. Once they have punched a hole in the enemy's front line, the second and third echelons pour through the gap. These tactics are simple and very effective.
Well, obviously, with these tremendous numbers, he can afford to take great losses. He's not the least bit hesitant to run a battalion or 2 battalions in, make a hole so that the 3rd battalion can make that penetration. He will oftentimes develop a main attack and several supporting attacks that may obviously not have much chance of success, but will be able to fix the U.S. forces in place while he makes the penetration where he wants that to occur.
The Soviets need big numbers for these tactics, but Lutz Unterseer, a West German who lectures at the British Army Staff College, has co-written a study called Is There a Tank Gap?
This numerical comparison as such does not take into account that there are many Warsaw Pact, particularly Soviet tanks, that are not available for a confrontation in Central Europe.
Of the 52,000 Soviet tanks, 17,000 must be deployed along the Chinese border. Another 5,000 are based in Central Asia to cope with areas of instability like Iran and Afghanistan. That leaves 30,000 Soviet tanks on the Central European front. These 30,000 Soviet tanks are confronted by 20,000 NATO tanks. So the ratio goes down from 2.5 to 1 in favor of the Soviets to 1.5 to 1. Add 1,500 tanks from France, which is not fully integrated into NATO, and the odds grow shorter still. But according to Phil Peterson, a Pentagon analyst who has made Soviet military doctrine his special subject, the Russians believe they can win with odds of only 1.5 to 1.
We have some Soviet calculations here that are used to teach their programs at the Voshilov General Staff Academy in Moscow. And as you can see from these figures on the right side, with as low as a 1.5 to 1 correlation of forces, you can get as high as a 5 to 1 correlation at the main point of attack.
It is the ability to concentrate their forces and obtain a massive local advantage that the Soviet High Command prizes most highly, and they don't need an overwhelming numerical advantage across the whole front to achieve this.
The example the Soviets still cite to their students, their general officers, that in the Battle of Stalingrad, they surrounded and destroyed von Paulus's 6th German Army with a correlation of forces that was only 1.1 to 1.
But the Soviet Army has numerous disadvantages. Many of their tanks will have difficulty reaching the front. While NATO has invested heavily in logistical support, Russian Army divisions only have 1 transporter for every 3 tanks. And this is just one of a number of technical handicaps that Unterseer lists in his study.
the modern guns of the two sides are equally powerful. So Soviet guns, to a certain degree, have closed the gap. However, they have not reached the high degree of precision Western tank guns have.
MIT professor Barry Posen explains why.
The systems that you use to sort of aim the gun and achieve first-round hit in Soviet tanks are not in the same class as those in Western tanks, period. Here we're talking about night sights, laser rangefinders, ballistic computers, and stabilizers that stabilize the gun so you can shoot off the move.
If you combine the built-in precision of Western tank guns, then you would end up in the result that Western tanks, on the average, are far superior in firepower to Soviet tanks.
We have various kinds of special armors in the West today going into our newest tanks. And these armors are very difficult to penetrate.
Tests show that the West's composite armors can take far more punishment than the Soviets.
They're hard to drill through and they're hard, in effect, to cut through. The evidence so far is that the Soviets are behind NATO in this technology.
Technologically backward, the Soviets have opted for quantity over quality, and as in World War II, have built large numbers of simple tanks.
They are simply not able to build as highly sophisticated tanks, highly complex tanks, as the West has. Until the 60s, the Soviets built into their tanks a tank engine which was designed in the mid-30s. And then when they tried to introduce new engines in by the end of the 60s and the 70s, they had quite a series of disasters with the T-64 and T-72, particularly with the T-64. Engines simply didn't work. They had a very high breakdown rate.
The poor performance of Soviet engines has affected the design of their tanks.
They may be, roughly speaking, 2/3 or 3/4 of Western tank size. Crew quarters are quite cramped, which results in crew fatigue and maybe bad tactical performance in the end. Also, you cannot store all your fuel inside the tank if you have sort of the Soviet design philosophy. So you store parts of the fuel on the fenders. Some Soviet tanks also carry fuel in drums on their rear section. This is, of course, not under armor protection. If they add more armor, given their weak engine technology, the tanks would become even slower than they are today, and their capability to cross rugged terrain would even be further reduced. So this is why they don't do it. They simply can't do it. Western tanks weigh more, but have relatively much stronger engines, so they can take on more armor.
All these factors help slim down the Warsaw Pact's 1.5-to-1 advantage in main battle tanks. And this, in turn, leads Lutz Unterseer to a conclusion that might surprise the bean counters.
NATO might be even superior in tank power in Central Europe, maybe by 1.2 to 1. At least you could say the two sides are they enjoy rough parity. So this is our contribution to destroying the myth of Soviet superiority in tanks.
Josh Epstein has fed the Defense Department assumptions into a computer model and reached a similar conclusion.
Even the Army's methods give a U.S. division about 1.5 times the lethality of its Soviet counterpart. I'm taking all of that into account when I run these runs. And what you see in this simulation is NATO coming from behind, although initially outnumbered, to win in the end in a very specific sense.
Of course, in a real battle, it wouldn't be a simple case of tank versus tank. the West would almost certainly enjoy air superiority. The A-10 plane is just one of a number of ways to kill tanks. Its cannon can penetrate the newest, most advanced Soviet armors, including reactive armor. The A-10 is a good example of the return the West gets for its investment in high tech, an investment in quality rather than quantity.
So we've made certain decisions about what matters most in modern warfare, and we haven't decided that the bean count is what matters most, and I think that's correct. But then it's inconsistent to turn around and pretend that the bean count were a revealing measure of the military balance when we spend our money as though it weren't. There are force multipliers in which we've invested heavily. Theater reconnaissance, command and control, logistics in the field, the training of our soldiers. In all these areas, I think we're superior to the Warsaw Pact, including combat technology itself. So I think when you do more serious analyses of the balance, analyses that take account of these non-bean count factors, you find that the military balance isn't nearly as bad as most people say.
But on Capitol Hill, the bean count will always be around. After all, it's a good political tool, especially when it comes to budget time. Politics is the subject of our next segment on the defense of Europe, politics here and across the Atlantic. We've already seen how the political impact of the German peace movement could affect the future of the alliance. But other issues divide the Allies too. For if Europeans feel they bear too much of the risk, many Americans say that we bear too much of the cost.
"300 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, where the temperature rarely rises above 20 below, Canadian ski troops take part in Operation Arrowhead Express. This NATO exercise is meant to simulate the reinforcement of Norway's 120-mile border with the Soviet Union. It's a combined operation that involves every kind of armament. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization defends a line that stretches from North Norway to East Turkey and includes 16 nations. For the past 40 years, the defense of Europe has been inextricably linked to the strategic interests of the USA, the leading power in the alliance.
American troops will remain in Europe under any administration so long as the need for a forward defense of our common values remains. We cannot and will not put our peace and freedom and that of our children and their children at risk.
The security of Europe is linked, is coupled with the security of the United States. And the principal ways that we've provided coupling is through the deployment in Europe of a substantial number of combat-ready troops, and secondly, through the extension of an American nuclear guarantee to Europe. In other words, any Soviet leader must take into account the possibility that the use of military force in Europe could lead to the use of American nuclear weapons.
When President Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev agreed to withdraw intermediate nuclear weapons, some Europeans feared it might have a decoupling effect. They foresaw the beginning of the end of America's nuclear guarantee to Europe. Others feared that the INF agreement might enable the superpowers to limit nuclear war to Europe while leaving their own countries unscathed.
This is part of the concern of risk sharing. Charles de Gaulle in the 1960s argued that the United States would not trade New York or Chicago for Paris. But that is, I think, a built-in concern that the Europeans will have.
We are, and always have been, prepared to commit our strategic forces to the defense of the alliance, and there's absolutely nothing that we have done in the past year and a half to signal any change in that doctrine. So I don't know why the concern arises at this particular point in time.
The concern first arose at Reykjavik, when Mr. Gorbachev and President Reagan actually talked of scrapping their nuclear arsenals. Europe's leaders saw the nuclear umbrella being folded up without so much as a word of prior consultation.
It wasn't just a matter of lack of consultation. This is a radical departure from the basic doctrine of the Western Alliance, that nuclear weapons are essential for our security, and that American nuclear weapons are essential for European security. And if you do that in a little town in Iceland on a weekend in October, my God, that must frighten politicians around the alliance. That's small wonder.
And in Europe, that's not all that frightens the political leaders of the alliance. They fear that as the Soviets seem less threatening, the Americans will grow less willing to help foot the bill for defense. They're already used to American complaints that Europe's economies have recovered from World War II. They know that massive deficits and a plunging dollar make many Americans wonder why the rich allies won't pay more for their own defense.
It's an important political phenomenon here, and our European friends need to understand that burden sharing has become a big issue in the United States. And while I think most Americans do not appreciate all the things that our European allies are doing, it is equally fair to say that our allies should do more.
In Washington today, the cost of defending Europe is becoming a hot political issue, and a recent poll showed that 53% of Americans feel they bear an unfair share of the burden. In fact, America spends $300 billion a year on defense, or 6.9% of its gross national product.
It's a huge amount of money. We have over 300,000 troops in Europe, 40 years after the war is over. Nobody that I know of in Europe is arguing that they spend as much on their military as we do on the average. They don't.
The Germans are spending half of what we're spending on defense. The Japanese 1/6 of what we're spending on defense. And that is not a fair or equitable sharing of the burden.
We're competing with them in a world marketplace. We're at a severe disadvantage when we're laying out such a disproportionate large share of our gross national product to defend ourselves and the Europeans and the Japanese and the Koreans and everybody else.
But Europeans argue that they do their fair share for the alliance. They provide 85% of NATO aircraft, 70% of its tanks, and 90% of its manpower.
If NATO has to mobilize its forces tomorrow, Chancellor Kohl will, within less than 7 days, be able to field 1.2 million German soldiers, all of them equipped, all of them trained. The Americans have much less than have the French or the Dutch or the Germans. None of us has ever done away with conscription, with the draft.
Helmut Schmidt and other German leaders always point to the draft as one of the reasons why they are bearing a fair share of the burden, and it's worth about 1/2% of the GNP, and so that would bring them from 3.2 to 3.7% of GNP, which is still half what the United States is.
They are spending much of that money for purposes which their allied nations, their allies, have never asked for. Nobody in Europe ever has asked them to develop SDI for them. It's their pleasure, not our defense.
The president can raise the issue of burden sharing at NATO meetings, but he has a problem. With massive U.S. investments at stake and annual trade worth $150 billion, America needs the alliance almost as much as Europe needs America. The U.S. might save money by pulling out troops, but it could pay a high price in terms of its own economy and its own security. And the Europeans know it.
Do you think it would be a very comfortable situation for the defense of the United States to have the Soviet Union all the way, all the borders of the North Atlantic? Do you think it would be a good thing for the United States to lose the markets of Europe? Do you think it would be a good thing for the United States to lose all its investments in Europe? Don't you think the United States might feel a little more isolated than they do now and find life a good deal more difficult?
If European politicians know how to play on American fears and keep so many troops committed there, American politicians know that reducing their commitment would mean reducing American influence.
I think it's important to recognize that no serious American politician is calling for a substantial withdrawal of American troops from Europe. There is a debate about our presence, but none of the presidential candidates, for example, are calling for a reduction of 100,000 troops along those lines.
If only they did, is my answer.
Well, if only they did,
it would very quickly, within 2 or 3 years, lead to a setting up of a West European defensive system, and integrated, including France.
And would America lose out by that?
And America, in fear of losing out, of losing its thumb in the pie, would very quickly redress that former resolution, pulling out.
The defense of Europe cost the U.S. dearly, but to bring home troops or weaken the nuclear guarantee would diminish American influence in an important part of the world. It would give away something the Soviets would have to bargain for. At the NATO summit last March, President Reagan probably had the Moscow summit in mind when he reaffirmed America's commitment to NATO and to nuclear deterrence.
All of us understand the absolute necessity of maintaining the credibility of our deterrent. We will never trade that credibility away at the negotiating table, and we won't give it away through neglect.
President Reagan's commitment to maintain nuclear deterrence as the key to the defense of Western Europe depends not only on achieving a balance of nuclear weapons with the Soviet Union. The U.S. must also continue to convince its allies and the Russians that in the end it is willing to actually use those weapons. In the final segment of this program, Time Washington Bureau Chief Strobe Talbot, who has written extensively on arms control, brings us back home from Europe to explore the dark dilemma at the heart of nuclear strategy.
The ultimate instruments of war are intercontinental ballistic missiles, like the Minuteman III ICBMs here at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. They are part of a very peculiar spectacle, an awesome display of warriors and weapons whose real mission is not to fight at all, but to prevent their enemy from fighting. Their mission, in short, is not war, but the deterrence of war. Throughout history, sooner or later, if political hostilities were sufficiently intense, deterrence failed and war began. The 19th century Prussian strategist Karl von Clausewitz put it this way: war, he said, is the continuation of politics or policy by other means. Then, suddenly, in 1945, literally in a flash of light, everything changed. The United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. Within months, a number of thinkers came to the revelation of a great paradox. The American scholar Bernard Brodie said it first and said it best. Thus far, he wrote, referring to the previous 92,000 years, the chief purpose of our military establishment has been to win wars. From now on, its chief purpose must be to avert them. It can have almost no other useful purpose. So in that sense, deterrence has become an end in itself, but it has also remained a paradox. Even in the nuclear age, the essence of deterrence is persuading your potential enemy that you mean business. If your enemy believes that you take Bernard Brodie's wisdom too literally and won't use your nuclear weapons under any circumstances, he may attack you or your allies. You will be the one who's deterred, not him. So the paradox in its starkest and most perplexing form is this: the alliance of industrialized democracies must have a plausible answer to the question, what if deterrence fails, in order to be sure that deterrence does not fail. Brodie realized that with nuclear weapons lurking in the background of the superpower competition, the day might come when the initiation of hostilities on any scale with any weapons would risk mimicking the phenomenon of nuclear fission that takes place inside the bomb itself. A single bullet fired in anger by a Soviet sentry at a GI on the other side of a barbed wire fence might be like a lone particle entering the unstable nucleus of a plutonium atom, setting off a chain reaction in which the two combatants would have obliterated each other and much else besides. Such an outcome would not qualify as victory for either side, nor would it qualify as defeat. It would qualify only as the end of days. No matter how successful Mr. Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev are at their summit in advancing the cause of reducing nuclear weapons, our safety and survival will continue to depend on the Soviets fearing that we might, in some extreme circumstance, use them, that we might do something that our best brains and highest leaders have said many times for many years would probably be suicidal. If that sounds less than entirely logical, be patient and be charitable. One can say about deterrence what Winston Churchill once said about democracy. It's the worst possible system except for any conceivable alternative. And consider also the illogic of the situation with which deterrence helps us to cope. Remember that if Alice were to tumble down the rabbit hole into the wonderland of nuclear strategy, there would be Bernard Brodie, puffing a hookah, sitting on a toadstool, and nearby, Clausewitz, standing on his head. Peace between the superpowers has become the conduct of war by other means. So it has been for more than 40 years. And if the soldiers, statesmen, and diplomats we have been listening to on this program are right, so it will be for another 40, for as long as it takes to come up with something better.
Thank you for joining us. For Frontline and for Time Magazine, I'm Judy Woodruff. Good night.
Frontline is produced for the Documentary Consortium by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content. Funding for Frontline was provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Educational organizations may inquire about videocassettes by calling 1-800-424-7963. For a transcript of this program, please send $4 to Frontline, Box 322, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134.